Life is first boredom, then fear. Whether or not we use it, it goes, and leaves what something hidden from us chose. And age, and then the only end of age. It was still dark when Smith got back from the woods, dazed and snow-drenched, but strangely thrilled by his blood in its hot spate and his face singing from the raw smack of cold. The knife was still in his hand. In the hallway, Smith looked at the clock. He'd been out for more than an hour. Else would be worried by now, trying to make sense of the cold triangle of bedsheet he'd left next to her. He would have to tell her about old John. Or at least, he would tell her that he'd come round selling firewood and that he'd slipped in the snow and soaked himself. He wouldn't tell her that a crow had come tapping on the window and that he'd followed it through the woods, the concentric halos from his torch flung about in the trees as he ran faster than he'd run in years. He wouldn't tell her what the crow had led them to, what he and Oscar had found by the lake shore. Old John jigging from a branch, drowning in mid-air. But upstairs, Else slept like the long dead. Every muscle sagged against its neighbour. She was a pile of limbs and lumps in the dark. He couldn't tell which way up she was. He could kiss an arm and get an ankle. Her neck might be a thigh. She breathed out the food she'd eaten before she came to bed like a set of alliacious bellows, adding another layer to the smells in the room that separated themselves clearly into the differently spiced fug of cigarettes and burnt pine wood, the blush of heated cedar floorboards, the lingering rankness of Oscar's meat breath licked over his fur. Miniature lavender cushions freshened the sock drawer. The pages of 30-year-old paperbacks had acquired, along with their tea-coloured tan, a smell of sawdust and plums. There was a bar of lemon soap cemented to the vanity basin, with a real slice of the fruit fixed in the resin. And settled somewhere below all this, like a steady thrum of electricity, was the sourness of the milk Else drank endlessly, to hold the chalk of her bones together. The whole house, in fact, seemed startling, as though it had been somehow washed anew in his absence, and every individual thing stood out, drip-drying. The dream he'd been having before the crow woke him lay amongst the sheets like an open door, or an amber light blinking. It wanted for completion, as if such a thing were possible. In a seamless narrative, he had dreamt about the shape of a lute, then the names of certain winds and their locations: Mistral, Provence; Bora, Croatia; Sirocco, Sahara. Then the jokes they made about the names of Else's medicines. Beniva was a resort on the Italian Med. Fosamax, a Swedish salmon dish to which they had added various other ingredients when resignation to Else's conditions had made them flippant, such as artichoke, capers, shredded beetroot and lime. The calamine-coloured pill Actonel was a character from a Shakespeare comedy, an impudent fool, he and Elsa decided, for whom they had invented appropriate couplets. Gentle mistress, do not thy legs bemoan. Marry lady, I shall mend the bones. The wakings lead on in dreams. Smith moved to the edge of the bed, wanting to climb in beside Else, swaddle himself in her smells, and forget why old John was sitting in their kitchen with his worldly possessions in a sodden pile on the floor. He said her name softly, then a little louder, but his voice only battered against the shell of sleep like a beam on a window. She didn't stir when he dragged the old suitcase and its dust off the top of the wardrobe. The usual stairs creaked all the way down to the kitchen, where old John was dressed in one of Smith's paint-stiffened sweaters, looking anxiously out of the window. The fishermen Smith had seen by the lake, the ones that had ignored his cries for help as he and the crow struggled with the rope, had followed them. They were shadows by the trees. Faintly, he could hear them talking. Smith pulled out a chair, and old John sat down, looking around the room at the books on the shelves, the Blake sketches on the wall, and the remnants of meals Smith and Else had eaten alone at different times. Knives and forks paired on oversized white plates, patterned with swirls of grease. Palettes of umbers and reds to paint something as dark as one of Rembrandt's late self-portraits or a John Martin Judgment. European colours, not the almost colours Smith had to use for these Arctic landscapes. The rest of the table was a voodoo altar, spread with the random votive offerings of pencils, pastels, brushes, tubes of paints rolled tightly to harvest the last globs of colour, skulls of various indigenous rodents for study, melted candles, an empty bottle of Malbec, some of Elsa's beads, a photograph of Elsa wearing the beads in front of the CN Tower, a chopping board strewn with the onion skins and garlic skins that looked like wood shavings, as though he had planed a door rather than made spaghetti. They'd been sorting through old boxes of letters and postcards and vinyl records from the 60s with brill-creamed, lantern-jawed crooners on the covers, and these too were heaped as they had left them. Gifts for the god of stuff, bewildering as Kabbalah to anyone but he and Else. And even to them, the significance of certain items was vague. That ugly wooden elephant next to the fireplace, those dried starfishes in a jam jar on the mantelpiece were somehow expressions of their shared life. But quite how, they were at a loss to explain. The porridge belched on the stove and Smith spooned some into a bowl for old John. "I'll drive you back when it gets lighter," he said, "before the snow comes." Smith made a fluttering motion with his hands. Old John nodded, though Smith wasn't convinced he'd understood, and turned the bowl and spoon in opposite directions to make huge mouthfuls that caught in his beard. He moved his gaze to Smith, his eyes red and wet with glaucoma, his tongue a pumice stone grating the black edges of his few remaining teeth. He was still hungry. Smith offered him bread. At first old John was uncertain, but then took the whole plate, nodding his head towards it in thanks. Smith saw that he hadn't washed for some time, the same length of time he'd gone without food by the look of it. Some families suffered at this time of year, when blizzards quickly isolated and buried. The elderly became burdens. It was village practice sometimes to ask the shaman to send a spirit down into the icy depths, to calm Sedna the seakeeper, to stroke her hair with a whalebone currycomb, and whisper oaths of love until she was pacified. Sometimes the old people were expected to take care of matters themselves. They packed the suitcase with John's old things, unidentifiable items of clothing, a pair of itchy socks, or were they mittens, a piece of walrus tusk with something inscribed along the side in a Inuktitut, various odds and ends, string and crow feathers wrapped around a twig, teeth from various animals, a black and white photograph of a strikingly handsome woman, his wife, perhaps, decades ago. Smith tried to give the hunting knife back to old John, but old John refused. In return, Smith offered old John a watercolour sketch he'd made of a storm cloud over the lake the previous summer, a black bloom of stratocumulus dwarfing the kayaks. Old John took the paper, looked at it, and then placed it carefully into the suitcase as he bent down to pick up the walrus tusk. "What does it say?" Smith asked, pointing at the writing. Old John read it in his language and mimed something that suggested it was an aid to sexual potency. Smith swapped it for a muskrat skull. And in this way they went on, trading a buckskin sporran for plastic beads, polar bear teeth for a tin of colouring pencils, twig, feathers and string for a scented candle, a pair of dice for a novelty baseball cap with Australia stitched across the front, and elasticated straps at the sides to hold beer cans. And then a gust flowed at the window and clattered the shutters, and they both looked. It was meaningful. For a day or two now there had been relative calm, as there often was before a great blizzard. The blizzard, Smith corrected himself. The rest had only been schemata for the one that rolled in from the high north at this time of year and wiped away all memory of sunlight and gave birth to the winter proper. The snow would come soon. It was time to go, Smith said. The fishermen were still outside, huddled around the car now, lifting up the tarpaulin cover and looking through the windows. They stopped talking when they saw Smith and old John. Close up, Smith could see there were versions of old John, his face at various ages ringed by grey fur. They were his sons and grandsons. They stared blankly as Smith and old John got into the car. Then as Smith drove away, one of them reached into a skin bag and threw something onto the windscreen. A dead crow, its neck broken and tied with string. Old John flinched and Smith fumbled for the lever that turned on the wipers. Its wings caught in the blades and the bird was red smeared across the glass a few times before it fell away into the snow and a few feathers remained.